This elevated green space weaves through dozens of buildings by some of the world's most famous architects. But none of this would exist if it weren't for hundreds of deaths on 10th Avenue nearly 2 centuries ago. I'm Nick Potts. I'm an architect, and today we're doing a walking tour of the High Line in New York City. This is the High Line Park in New York City's meatpacking district. This is a neighborhood that got its name from the industry that it once served, with provided beef, veal, and pork to markets and cities all throughout the northeastern United States. It also had a lot of railroad traffic that originally was at the same level of the street, which turned out to be quite dangerous. Back in the 1800s, early 1900s, this area was known as Death Avenue, and several hundred people actually lost their lives due to collisions with trains. Because of this dangerous situation, the city eventually built an elevated rail line to permit the huge scale of industrial production to coexist with the street-level activity of an active neighborhood within a growing metropolis. After its decline as an industrial neighborhood in the middle of the 20th century, this neighborhood searched for a new identity. The redevelopment of the High Line from an abandoned rail line to a vibrant green space catalyzed more development in the last 15 years in this part of New York City than anywhere else. It's really a unique situation to have this concentration of contemporary buildings designed by star architects in one area, and without the High Line, none of these buildings would have been built. Behind me is the Chelsea Market, but if we take a bit of a trip back into history, the reason why the High Line as a rail line existed was because of a building like this. This was an Nabisco factory, and so because this was an industrial district prior to its current form, a lot of the buildings around here would have been similar to this, multi-level industrial warehouse buildings connected to the High Line and connected the goods being made in this building into the rail system in the country. You can see there are these sky bridges that connect horizontally from site to site in these very authentic relics of its industrial past. As the meatpacking industry and industrialized food production moved elsewhere, this neighborhood went into decline, and relics that were left really contributed to its decline further and further, and it took the redevelopment of places like the Chelsea Market and the High Line itself to really kind of bring people back and take what had been a bit of an urban liability and turn it into an asset in terms of the redevelopment. Of the Chelsea Market, it was a bit of a pioneer. It was one of the first projects in the country that kind of took advantage of these disused industrial sites and turned them into commodified marketplaces, kind of glamorizing the grit, the rusted steel, exposed brick, this kind of romanticized industrial style. And so a lot of those warehouses, buildings, kind of remade themselves into new spaces within their existing forms, spaces for creative industries, for film studios, originally for art galleries. There are people like Diane von Furstenberg who very early came into this neighborhood and built a headquarters and a studio. And the sorts of things that showed up in this building because it was converted into a market, it really planted the seed for retail within this very small footprint of what used to be an industrial neighborhood. Behind me is 520 West 28th Street. This is a building designed by British-Iraqi architect Zaha Hadid. This is an example of what we would call a designer building. It's a phenomenon that you see pop up again and again around the High Line. In the 15 years since the High Line opened in 2009, it's attracted a collection of buildings from the most famous architects practicing in the world. People like Frank Gehry, Jean Nouvel, Jeannie Gang, Shigeru Ban. It's almost like a collection of designer clothes in a fancy department store. It's a phenomenon that's really unique in New York City to have this level of famous architects working in one area, and it's all enabled by this very famous, very public space, the High Line, that catalyzed all these luxury developments. These buildings are really about a brand, and they're about a premium product being marketed to buyers both from New York and globally. You think about a building like 520 West 28th, which is an apartment building, and this very public element and this aspect of people taking pictures of your building while you're inside of a very private, intimate space is really engaging in this game of urban peacocking of, it's a private building that wouldn't exist without existing on a very public right-of-way. And it's showing off in a very kind of ostentatious, look at me sort of way. But it's still encompassing and holding a lot of very private spaces. So like a lot of designer goods, there's almost an aspect of look but don't touch with this. None of the buildings on the High Line can be entered from the High Line. So you're interacting visually, but you're physically not permitted. The buildings are actually separated. None of them touch. You don't have doors going onto the line. And so the relationship that these buildings have is purely visual. You're looking as it as an amenity, but you're physically not engaging with it. Behind me is the Whitney Museum of American Art. And in terms of location, the Whitney is also the first building a person encounters as they enter the High Line from the south. It's this very kind of opaque building that doesn't really engage with this amazing linear realm that the High Line has created. Really, the Whitney was trying to, add their piece as a public building as opposed to the private starch buildings that the rest of the High Line has. This is kind of your standard approach when you're building a new museum, is to attach a name to it. Here, it's Renzo Piano. This is after the Chelsea Market. This is after kind of the first phase of kind of the retail takeover of this neighborhood happened. But what's interesting about it is partially how it references the industrial history of this site. It's almost appropriating the language of a factory here in a very vertical, almost industrial expression of the building, which is a fairly interesting expression for an art museum. The Whitney really doesn't showcase anything about what's going inside the building. It looks opaque, it's kind of mysterious. The only time that you really engage with the High Line is when you're inside the Whitney looking down from the balconies or from spaces at the ends of the galleries that are designed to look out over the High Line. As the most public building on the High Line, it's interesting to think that it's also one of the most unapproachable and severe. Would it have made sense to be a little bit more public-facing, be a little bit more welcoming? Over my shoulder is Hudson Yards. It's a 15 million square foot development at the northern end of the High Line. The High Line grew from south to north, starting around 14th Street. Here we're at 30th Street, and by the time this was ready to be built, it was very apparent that the West Side could take a development of this size because the High Line was so successful in bringing people and bringing money to this area. Developers decided to go big and to create this major commercial, residential, and retail development right here at the northern end of the High Line. Here at 30th Street, this is really where the spur of the High Line connected back into the train network. If you think back to the origins of this place, everything behind me was essentially a parking lot for trains, ringed by a ramp that brought the trains that ran on the High Line up a level to separate them from the street grid. At Hudson Yards, they were able to raise the ground plane up to the level of the High Line. It's really the reconnection of the pedestrian flow that the High Line enables into the new shopping center, into the new public plaza, where the High Line originally connected the trains back into the train network. Now, people essentially have taken on that role through this direct connection from the raised level of the High Line to the raised level of Hudson Yards. You think about the shed, you think about these giant towers, you think about the vessel, you think about these mega development and this mall. It was all really made possible by the proving of the thesis of the High Line, which is that these designer buildings, these kind of mini branded moments, can coalesce into an intense, vibrant urban setting. And over the last 15 years, the success of the High Line really catalyzed the complete redevelopment of the meatpacking district. The High Line has really proved itself out, and the fact that the meatpacking district and Hudson Yards have been the center of development and the largest redevelopment project in Manhattan, it's really because of the seed that was planted with the High Line. For more stories about how architecture can transform our built environment, check out our other episodes of Walking Tour.